All right, we are going to get going here in just a moment. Allow a little bit more time for folks to join. Thank you all for being here. If you've tried to access the MEI FMEP Congressional Briefing on Israel-Palestine, this is session 5. You are in the correct place. We're just going to give it another minute. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and start. So good morning and welcome to our 5th session in the 6-part congressional briefing series, Israel-Palestine, Key Issues for the 118th Congress. I'm Kristen McCarthy. I'm the Director of Grants and Operations at the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and I'm pleased to be co-hosting today's session with Khaled Al-Gindi, who is the Director of the Middle East Institute's Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs. Khaled.
Thanks, Kristen. So today's session is on internal Palestinian politics, in which we'll be looking at the state of Palestinian politics, political institutions, as well as the future of the Palestinian national movement more broadly, including the effects of the ongoing political division between Fatah and Hamas, the question of if, when, or how to hold elections, prospects for PLO reform, and other types of institutional reforms, as well as likely challenges of political succession in a post-Abbas era. So to help us better understand these issues, we've assembled another really excellent panel. I'll introduce them here briefly in alphabetical order, but you can see their full bios on the landing pages for this series on both the MEI and FMEP websites. So first we have Salim Barahma, who is with Uncivilized Media, and he's a longtime political activist and organizer. He's joining us from Jericho in Palestine. Next we have Dana Al-Kurd, who is assistant professor of political science at the University of Richmond, and also a non-resident scholar with the Palestine program at MEI. And lastly, we have Khalid Horoub, who is a professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar, joining us from Doha. In addition to the landing pages for our websites, keep an eye out on the chat box for Twitter handles and other resources that our colleagues will be putting in over the course of our discussion, links to articles or events or other kinds of content related to today's discussion. And if you miss anything, don't worry, we'll be adding those materials to the website for this series later on.
Great, and quick housekeeping notes that if you've been to a previous session, you know this already, but just to reiterate that today's format is like all of our sessions, it's a moderated question and answer led by me and Khaled. We'll have some basic questions to get things started, and we very much welcome and encourage questions. You can put your questions in the Q&A box feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. Submit your questions anytime during the webinar. We'll do our best to kind of weave them in as they come. And thank you in advance for doing that. And finally, please note that we are recording this webinar. It will be released later for the public. The public will never see names of participants or your questions. So please feel free to question or put your questions in as many as you have. But if you have any technical problems, please use the chat box for that. And with that, let's begin.
Great. So just a little bit of context before we delve into the subject. So I think, as most people know, Palestinian politics and political institutions have been in a state of disarray and decline for many years. The problems span the entire gamut, from political division, institutional decay, both within the Palestinian Authority and the Palestine Liberation Organization, chronic financial problems, growing corruption and authoritarianism, both in Ramallah and in Gaza. All of these highlight what many people, particularly Palestinians, see as a much deeper crisis of legitimacy, as well as a lack of strategic vision for Palestinian liberation by either the PA in Ramallah or Hamas in Gaza. All of this is happening in a particularly hostile environment at the local, regional, and international level. Locally, of course, violence by both the Israeli army and settlers is at an all-time high, while the settlement project is succeeding at the de facto annexation of more and more land. The Arab states, who once formed a critical base of support for the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian cause more broadly, have largely deprioritized and in some cases maybe even abandoned the Palestinian issue as more and more Arab governments seek separate normalization deals with Israel. Meanwhile, the US, the EU, and the broader international community are largely distracted with other priorities, and in any case seem unable to offer any new ideas. So before we delve into the discussion, I think it's worth taking a step back to provide a little bit more context in terms of Palestinian politics, which are a little bit idiosyncratic in a number of ways, but particularly in that they're operating in a context of Israeli occupation. And so that limits in many ways the freedom of decision-making of Palestinian leaders. And also they're operating with this sort of duality of institutions in the form of both the PLO on the one hand, which was established in 1964 as the umbrella organization to represent Palestinians everywhere. And on the other hand, we have the Palestinian Authority, which is created in 1994 as an outcome of the Oslo process, which has a slightly different mandate. On paper, the PA was to be a sort of administrative body running the day-to-day affairs of Palestinians in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza, while the PLO remained the primary political address of the Palestinian national movement. For example, it's the PLO and not the PA that negotiates on behalf of the Palestinians and that sits in international forums like the United Nations and the Arab League. Whereas in reality, the PA has all but eclipsed the PLO as the primary venue for Palestinian politics. So Dana, I want to ask you to start us off with a kind of basic lay of the land. What makes the Palestinian body politic unique? What makes it tick, both in terms of the issues that animate Palestinian politics and in terms of the actual structures that we talked about of governance and leadership? What does governance in the West Bank and Gaza actually look like, given people often confuse the PLO with the PA or use them interchangeably? And so how do these two bodies relate to each other? And also how do they operate in the context of Israeli occupation?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for having me. So I will first start by saying that there's basically, we could say 5 or 6 Palestinian realities, and this is what kind of shapes the Palestinian situation overall. So first, there are Palestinians in Gaza under a particular kind of governance, Palestinians in the West Bank under different layers of governance and also a particular kind of governance, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, again, operating under a different set of institutions, a different set of limitations. There are Palestinian refugees and or diaspora. So that's why I said 5 or 6, if you want to count, Palestinian refugees who are recognized as refugees, as well as those who have left as part of both political and economic kind of reasons in the diaspora later on. And then Palestinians within the Green Line, within Israel. So given the kind of array of realities that the Palestinians function under, I think each of these communities has a difference in the hierarchy of priorities in terms of their political objectives. And that's not, by mistake or by kind of a lack of strategy. It's very much a direct result of both Israeli as well as kind of international policy towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has, diverged and fragmented the Palestinians to this degree. So Oslo in particular I know you referenced the Palestinian Authority, so I'll get to that in a second. But the Oslo framework, in particular, exacerbated this divergence between the different Palestinian communities and what they see as kind of their top priorities to deal with the the challenges they face in each of their realities. I'll get back to that because I think there's now more of a convergence in the last year or two, but yeah, just setting that aside. So in terms of governance in all of these areas, Gaza is governed by, as you mentioned, like a Hamas government, which is maybe less fragmented in terms of its governance as a result of the blockade, as a result of Gaza's situation. The West Bank governance, however, is quite layered and fragmented in the sense that the Palestinian Authority function in certain areas and not others, and they're losing their grip on the areas that they're supposed to be governing, even under the kind of Oslo framework. There's the Israeli occupation layer, there's the Palestinian Authority layer, there's the municipal layer, the local layer, as well as kind of grassroots initiatives that are also vying for control, largely as a result of the Palestinian Authority's inability to service the population. So all of that is happening in the West Bank. East Jerusalem, they're functioning under direct Israeli occupation and are dealing with a particular set of challenges and statelessness in a way that I think doesn't necessarily match the other parts of the Palestinian body politic. But so all of that is happening now. Why I mentioned there's maybe more of a convergence in the last couple of years on the hierarchy of priorities is for two reasons. Even though there are all of these kind of fragmentations, and that has kind of led different Palestinian communities in different directions in the last maybe 30 years. The last couple of years, as a result of both Israeli intransigence and increased kind of Israeli extremism and radicalism, as well as the response, the Unity Intifada in 2021 and kind of the aftermath of that, there now is more of a discussion about how we might converge on what it is that Palestinians are demanding, and kind of to break free of these fragmented realities that has been imposed upon them since 1994 in particular. I know you also, sorry, I'm all over the place. I know you also asked a question about the PA and the PLO. The reason that, the last thing I'm going to say is the reason they are confused is because the PLO has largely become irrelevant, and because many of like the only functioning or semi-functioning institutions within the PLO, which is, as you said, it's large umbrella organizations, so the PLO Executive Committee or the PLO Central Council, or those kinds of things overlap almost entirely with some of the people in the PA, and are controlled by Mahmoud Abbas and the people in the PA. And so the PLO has been left largely to function as kind of just a ghost institution. I don't know what do they I think there's a term for it in IR. It's like a zombie institution or something. So it's no longer functioning. And there have been some calls to maybe revive the PLO and things like that. We can get to that in the next couple of questions, but yeah, hopefully I answered everything.
Thank you, Dana. I hope we can get back to the convergence of priorities later. But before we do, I want to turn to Khaled and talk more about this fragmentation and the obstacles to that. So Khaled, one of the most serious obstacles to Palestinian political cohesion is not just the political and it's the political and geographic split between the two largest political factions, Fatah, which dominates the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and Hamas, which governs the Gaza Strip. So this division has been in place since 2007, following Hamas's legislative victories the previous year. And since then, we've seen numerous attempts to try to reunify the PA and Hamas, including about a dozen reconciliation agreements between Hamas and Fatah over the last dozen years or so, and most recently in September 2020, following Arab normalization deals. None of these have succeeded at reintegrating the Palestinian polity. So first, can you tell us what impact has this division had on Palestinian governance and leadership on the one hand, and Palestinian national aspirations on the other? And second, how central is reconciliation to reviving a unitary Palestinian political leadership, in your view? And lastly, what are the major issues preventing that reconciliation? All of that.
My God, so many things. Thank you very much for this question. Let me kind of try to use my few minutes in summarizing the main points, at least that relate to your questions. I'm going to look at them from two perspectives. One is Palestinian, and another one is, let's say, Israeli, or let's say peace process perspective. From a Palestinian perspective, as we all know, the split took place in 2007, as you said, after the elections, maybe less than a year. And then we ended up with two entities. In the Gaza Strip, you have Hamas controlling the politics, the land, of course, but of course under Israeli air, sea, and land kind of a blockade. And then the other blockade is the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority led by Fatah. This kind of split in geography, in the demography, in the politics of the Palestinians, of course, obviously took its toll on the Palestinians, almost in, I would say, in all aspects. Politically, of course, hindered, the emergence of any effective or unified leadership. At the national level, it deeply harmed even the psyche of the Palestinians, the sense of nationhood, the national pride of the Palestinians and belonging. And in terms of disconnecting the geography and even the physical movement between the two parts. So it has created great kind of catastrophic, I would say, consequences for the Palestinians. Now, every one of these, Hamas on this side, the PA on the other side, would function separately. I have this kind of metaphor saying, in the West Bank, we have hard politics, supposedly is run by Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority. And on the side of Gaza and Hamas, you have hard resistance is run by them. And when I say hard resistance, this refers to the missile and bombs and the things that not every ordinary Palestinian can use. So you have a monopoly of hard resistance here. You have a monopoly of hard politics here. When I say hard politics, this refers to negotiations, diplomacy, the things that, again, ordinary Palestinians cannot engage with. So this kind of, these two monopolies left the bulk of the Palestinians in the middle, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. So you have these two processes, in fact, neutralizing the vast majority of the Palestinians, either inside Palestine or outside Palestine. And this is for me, another kind of catastrophic consequences of this split, because this main bulk of the Palestinians that used to be very active, this bulk led the first intifada, the second intifada, and nowadays somehow revived in certain pockets here and there. This is the strategic reservoir for the Palestinians, if you like. Now, the last point that I want to kind of to refer to here, that this split, now this is from the perspective of the peace process, if you like. This split is used by Israel and sometimes by the Americans and others as the main, or at least one of the main obstacles facing the resumption of the peace process. Why we are not doing any negotiations? Because the Palestinians are divided. And for me, this is a pretext, because the Palestinians used to be functioning under one unified leadership since 2000, at least since 1967, until the split, until the division, 2007. This means we had 40 years of one single Palestinian voice, one single leadership leading the Palestinians, and nothing happened on the ground. So I just wanted to highlight this pretext in our kind of discussion here, or at least in my first intervention. I'm looking at the time, I think I need to stop.
Thanks for that, Khaled. Salam, I want to turn to you. Obviously, Palestinian division is just one aspect of a deeper set of problems. Over past decade, especially, we've seen an increase in authoritarianism and corruption in both of these authorities, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And of course, in the absence of a functioning parliament, there are few, if any, checks on President Abbas's power, who basically rules by decree. We saw just last week how PA security services raided and shut down a civil society sponsored conference that was planning to issue a statement of some sort criticizing the Palestinian leadership and calling for general elections. This is something that we've seen repeatedly. And of course, we had last year the killing of Nizar Banat, a prominent political dissident and anti-Abbas activist who was killed by Palestinian security forces actually 2 years ago, almost. So as someone who's been active in civil society, in various NGOs, where does this trend of growing authoritarianism come from, and what does it mean in terms of this shrinking space for civil society to operate for the future of Palestinian politics?
Thank you, Khaled, and thanks everyone. It's great to be with you. It's no longer a growing trend. We do live under an authoritarian regime. I mean, we have an unelected leadership that's been there for more than 15, 16 years now, and there are no political or national institutions. There's no political system. There haven't been elections. I'm almost 34 years old, and I've never voted in a Palestinian election other than municipal elections. And there are no new political parties. There's no space to organize. The crackdown is extremely harsh. And anyone who voices a dissenting opinion, let alone call for elections or democracy or representation, is swiftly shut down. And that's part of a existentialist feeling the leadership in the West Bank has about their position. I mean, if you look at the West Bank, they basically only control a few cities. Nablus, Jenin, majority of the North and West Bank is not under their full control. And if you go south to Hebron, I mean, the PA is not very welcome in Hebron either. So they're in a position of fear, even though they still have to an extent a monopoly on violence. And the leadership is towing the line that is promoted by the Americans, the Israelis, and the international community, which is the two-state solution. So they're very much in a position that serves the interests of most, and they have no internal checks, no external checks. And at the moment, for them, it's about how do you maintain power at all costs. And this is where we've arrived. And so people always ask for the Palestinian opposition. When are they going to rise up? Where's this third party that goes beyond Fatah and Hamas? Well, there's no space for it because on one level you have authoritarianism, and then on another level you have apartheid. And between both, it's very hard to get anything going. And so now people are extremely disillusioned with the political process and are going to the armed struggle. One in reaction to Israeli apartheid and settler violence, and the other is the lack of a political process, representation, and a direction forward. It's very simple.
Thanks, Salam. I'm going to stick with you and dig into some of these issues. You've kind of anticipated my next set of questions here, but I'm going to ask you to give a little bit more. And a lot of people still see, and this might just be the international community, that they think the best way to revive Palestinian politics and restore legitimacy to the Palestinian leadership is through elections. As you mentioned, the last time any national elections were held in Palestine was 2006. And that led to the rise of Hamas in Gaza. In 2021, President Abbas surprised everyone by announcing a timetable for new elections in the spring and summer of 2021. The elections were going to be held in 3 phases, starting with the Palestinian Authority legislative elections, then the presidential election, and then culminating in the Palestinian National Council, which is the PLO's long dormant parliament. A total of 37 electoral lists and almost 14,000 candidates had signed up to take part in those elections. But 3 weeks before they were scheduled for the first vote, Abbas canceled those elections. So can you talk to us about why those elections were canceled? What does that say about the electoral process in general? How did it affect Abbas's domestic credibility? And if you would, humor us with your prediction for if elections are possible in the near future, if that's something that we should be looking to.
Sure. Look, I think the numbers you laid out for how many lists registered is indicative of how hungry and thirsty Palestinians were for, one, democracy, two, the opportunity to elect their own leadership and representation. I think we crave it because we feel like the national movement is already on its deathbed, and we need to revive it with new people, with a new vision, with a new strategy, and that can't be built on the same structures and people who currently lead it. And so the cancellation came due to the lack of popularity by Abu Mazen's party, Fatah, within Palestine. I think they were, polling very poorly. They had troubles putting a list together, and all the grievances within Fatah came to the surface, and there was a lot of infighting. And the calculation was, going ahead with the election would be bad for us, and so let's cancel it. Essentially, I think that's the analysis many people read into. And I think what's really interesting to observe is that the official excuse used was that the Israelis wouldn't allow elections in Jerusalem. Now, at the same time, almost around the same time, it was almost around Ramadan, there was Palestinian youth in Jerusalem were standing up to Israeli soldiers as they were pretty much imposing on their ability to celebrate Ramadan in Jerusalem. And there was also the ethnic cleansing and expulsion of people from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Young people decided to confront Israel in Jerusalem. Abu Mazen had the chance to get people behind him and confront Israelis in Jerusalem by holding elections and challenge them and fully confronting them. And he chose to cancel. And I think that shows you essentially in a nutshell where young Palestinians are and where the leadership is. And it's a massive gap. And so I don't think that elections are coming anytime soon, although I think they would be the beginning of trying to rebuild some sort of sense of unity amongst Palestinians and the factions. And I think we also need to remember that, amongst regional players and international players, the Palestinian leadership is very much, not fully sovereign in the sense that Israel, the US gets to, and some regional countries really get to dictate and pressure whether elections happen as well. And I think that's the other thing we need. And so if elections were to happen, they also need US support. And that, according to my understanding, wasn't the case. And Israelis also didn't want elections. So, it's an equation with many variables. But I think elections are necessary, and they're a good step forward, even though they won't solve everything, but they are something to get the ball rolling.
Thanks, Salem. Dana, I want to ask you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the importance of holding elections, especially given some of the risks and restrictions that Salem alluded to. Palestinians don't have full control over even their own domestic politics. But I also want to ask you about another key demand that we often hear from Palestinians, and that is the need to revive, reactivate, or rehabilitate the PLO in some form as the primary address for the Palestinian national movement, which, as you indicated, has been basically in a state of paralysis, or you could use the term zombie institution. So as a member yourself of this Palestinian diaspora, what is the significance of the PLO in terms of the Palestinian national aspirations and moving them forward? And how feasible is this idea of reviving or rehabilitating the PLO? Or is it time simply to look for a new institution and replace the old PLO?
Yeah, lots of big questions. So, first, just a note: the zombie organization is a term by Julia Gray. So I didn't make it up. It's an actual thing. But aside from that, yeah, these are big questions, and I am a member of the Palestinian diaspora, and obviously very invested in what happens as a Palestinian. But I hesitate to make to make grand proclamations. Like, at the end of the day, the people who live on the ground are the ones who have to deal with the consequences. I would say, however, that in terms of elections and their role, Saddam makes many very good points about how his theory of change is that they might be kind of a starting point for shifts in Palestinian politics. The alternative, which what I'm about to say is often used by people who just don't want to be accountable. So just to make that clear, but there is something to be said about the fact that elections under these circumstances help to create one kind of a channeling of Palestinian energies, maybe in the not most fruitful direction. The second is in the international community, even though, as Sada mentioned, like, they weren't actually behind these elections, and the Biden administration couldn't care less about supporting them. But even so, if elections were to move forward, kind of in the West Bank at the very least, there is some fear that it's used by the international community and used by Israel to say, like, these are domestic issues, or this is how they have to sort themselves out and see they have some level of self-governance and they have some level of autonomy. So that's one kind of worry about focusing on elections as a tool. The second worry is that, given the circumstances, given the fragmentation, and given that large segments of the Palestinian population, even on the ground, cannot really participate properly. So I know East Jerusalem, for example, was used as a fig leaf by the Palestinian Authority, but it's true that they cannot participate. And then, obviously the fragmentation between Gaza and the West Bank as well. It's just, at the end of the day, you wonder how useful that all that effort is in terms of making any kind of significant change. Now, to be clear, Palestinians on the ground do need some levels of accountability. So, like, municipal elections, for example, are different from the things we're discussing. And I'm not claiming elections off the board, but there is something to be said about possibly looking elsewhere, given all of the obstacles that face the Palestinians, and given the finite amount of resources and energy that we have. As you said, there was some discussion about reviving the PLO. That's been going on for quite some time. And even though it is a zombie organization, but I think the reason people the PLO did represent Palestinians across the diaspora as well. And certain Palestinians in the current context are completely cut out of the equation, which actually has huge ramifications about how we foresee a conclusion or a solution to this problem. If huge swaths of the Palestinian population are cut out of any kind of final negotiation process, then this is a problem. So the PLO, on that sense, was a very important organization. And in spite of all of the, the severe repression, the assassination, everything that Palestinians faced, the PLO continued to function. At varying levels, perhaps, but still continued to function. So the reason I think people want to revive the PLO is because we shouldn't throw all of that effort out. There have been these attempts, I think quite marginal attempts, by leftist activists and organizations on one hand, and then also maybe more, maybe this is unfair to say, but maybe more Islamist aligned organizations and individuals on the other hand, to create kind of alternatives to the PLO, but they have been very marginal in their impact. And so that's why people have said, maybe that's the path forward, is to revive the PLO and to pressure the Palestinian Authority to do that. That being said, you asked about how likely that is, or like how feasible. I think logistically, especially in today's day and age, like, it is feasible. we are much more connected than the Palestinians in the past were. We also Palestinians, particularly in the global north, have made huge strides, and so logistically, we could very much foresee, like, you know, getting Palestinians together, even doing certain types of voting and things like this. What makes it infeasible is a lack of political will, and so that's where the PLO question also kind of falls on the wayside when we think about the range of strategies that are available, which is, again, to allude to Salem's answer earlier, is why people have taken to more grassroots organizing and more militant and more armed resistance as a result of this reality. I don't know if I answered everything, but there we go.
You did a great
Can I
job.
make a quick comment on the election thing?
Sure,
Just,
I have a question for you about elections. Can I ask it?
Okay.
And then you can answer what you want.
Yeah,
But I want to come back to you because part of the challenge of either reviving the PLO or holding elections is the question of Hamas. Either of those things would necessarily require formally integrating Hamas into the Palestinian body politic, which of course is going to pose a problem for Abbas and Fatah, who don't want competition, but also for Israel and the US and most of the international community that have designated Hamas as a terrorist organization and have barriers around interacting with Hamas or bodies in which Hamas is a part as a formal, legitimate political actor. So I want to ask you, how can Palestinians go about integrating Hamas politically without triggering the international sanctions that might come with it, especially given the PA's and Abbas's massive dependence on the US and Israel and international donors? And is it possible to revive Palestinian politics without Hamas?
Yeah,
Tell
thank
me.
you very much for this. Yeah, let's kind of talk maybe quickly about the premise of the question. When somebody says, because this is all over the place, maybe the same kind of design of the question. Can Palestinians or can the region or can whoever, or in what ways should they integrate Hamas? Who integrates whom? And why Hamas is seen as kind of a separate entity than the Palestinians? The Palestinians should integrate Hamas. This is a group, for me, I am kind of a secular and all of that, but this is a group that has emerged within the Palestinian people, winning free and fair elections in 2006. And it's not kind of a matter of integration. It has been already, it integrated itself in the system, I think, in the political system. And it's a matter of others to acknowledge and recognize this reality. And for me, I think there is no way forward for the Palestinians without the so-called integration of Hamas, because this is not a marginal group, 5%, 10% of the Palestinians. In every single poll or survey, whether we like it or dislike it, they have, you know, almost kind of half of the percentage as others. They compete strongly in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. So it's kind of the idea of integrating Hamas, I think, or shall we integrate Hamas? I think it needs to be even dismantled in terms of conceptually speaking. Now, when Hamas won the elections in 2006 and all that kind of crippling strategy led by Israel and the United States, it says, you know, a lot about the whole system and the Palestinian, if you like, politics. That this politics is in fact controlled and somehow maybe caged even in certain place, and you are allowed to move around within that limited space, within that cage. And if the guardians of the cage are unhappy with some group within that cage taking over the others, they would kind of, maybe they shut down the gates of the cage. They would tell the cage to destabilize the whole situation. And this is what's happening. And this takes me, I think, to maybe the point that I wanted to make about, you know, the impact of external factors in the Palestinian politics. And this is a long debate, of course, whether internal or external factors, you know, take a priority and impact the situation more. I don't think that we can have a black and white answer to all situations. I think we need to have every single maybe case, context, and even timeline as well along our analysis. Maybe in certain times we can blame the Palestinians because they missed opportunities and they had the chance to do this and that. But I think at this very moment, 2023, with the current kind of fanatic government, Israeli government, and with the regional conditions that Khalid read about, in his introduction, I think even if the Palestinians had a Scandinavian-like government, the change would be very incremental, because the pressures and the impositions on the Palestinians are unbearable. You cannot simply, the point of the elections, you cannot simply hold elections, even if all parties agreed, even if Mahmoud Abbas suddenly became kind of a prophet of democracy, simply because Israel would say no to the elections in Jerusalem. That's it. Then they can veto the process. The reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, they placed, and they could even add more, they placed conditions, and they could even add more conditions to that reconciliation, and that would go nowhere. So you have all these pressures nowadays, especially in the last, let's say, 5 years, and now maybe peaking to the highest point nowadays in this year, where you have the Palestinians, in fact, when it comes to the big issues, they have little to small room to maneuver, I think. The international community would not interfere positively when they kind of watch the Palestinians, let's say, heading to an impasse in terms of a democratic governance, let's say. When we compare, just kind of to compare the influence of external players, if you go back in 2003, 2004, George W. Bush was unhappy at one time with Yasser Arafat's monopoly of power. He thought he is centralizing too much power in his own hands, and they pressured him to appoint Mahmoud Abbas as a prime minister, kind of a division of power or distribution of power. Arafat was very stubborn. He fought really very hard against this, but at the end of the day, he couldn't but to yield to those pressures. And then Mahmoud Abbas became a prime minister under Arafat's presidency. This means if there was a will from the international community, and maybe just kind of a shorthand to the USA, America, to interfere in positively, to push Israel, to say, yes, we want elections, we want Palestinian elections, we want some sort of Palestinian consensus so that we can move forward. In this case, you have things kind of moving. But without the engagement of external players at this very moment, I can't see things moving on. In fact, the US maybe and the EU to a lesser degree, they are happy with the situation, with the status quo. Mahmoud Abbas accumulating even more power than Arafat used to have in his own hands. Okay, be it, as long as the status quo is just going on and the escalation takes place within an accepted kind of degree. Even nowadays, the talk is about the de-escalation, which is escalation is accepted, but we need kind of an accepted kind of level of it. Now, the last point, maybe this is, if you like, the forest perspective. The tree perspective, if you go down to Abu Mazen himself and vis-a-vis the whole idea of integrating Hamas, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas is not into this mood anyway. He has so many issues with Fatah itself, his own movement. Fatah has split into different groups, some of them totally kind of now outside the formal movement and others inside, but still you have at least 2 or 3 Fatahs with us. So let alone to integrate Hamas or to talk about Hamas or to think about some inclusive system whereby you have all Palestinian parties and players coming together and then creating a consensus or a collective leadership. So Mahmoud Abbas totally different kind of mode of thinking, and he is having no pressure either, especially from outside. The last thing, the international community, when it comes to Hamas, I think this was mentioned in the question somehow. They placed on Hamas a set of conditions, and they are known as the Quartet 3 conditions: to recognize Israel, to denounce terrorism, quote unquote, and then to acknowledge and all the agreements signed on upon by Israel and the PLO. 3 conditions, very solid conditions. And I think Hamas in 2006, 2007, they had gone through almost halfway in meeting these 3 conditions. They accepted a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders. Yes, they added to that, without recognizing Israel. Okay, but at least it was kind of indirect way, just to appease their constituencies and to say we are still holding to our principles. And they stopped resistance, and they're saying resistance does have so many forms, including politics. And then by the mere fact of participating in those elections and becoming the government of the self-rule system, they in fact acknowledged, if you like, the parameters, general ones of Oslo Accords. But there was, I think, from my humble analysis, there was no coming to Hamas from the other end. So if they met, let's kind of meet halfway, there was no sincere or no even intention, no desire to include Hamas, not because they didn't like Hamas, for me, because the whole idea of having a Palestinian consensus, a Palestinian agreement, collective agreement, ran against the intentions and maybe kind of the plans or whatever was the major and dominant political thinking of the moment.
Thanks, Khaled. Salam, I want to turn to you and talk a little bit about the current realities on the ground. As you know, we've seen a major surge in violence. 2022 was an especially bad year for Palestinians in the West Bank, and 2023 is looking even worse. I think something like 80 Palestinians or so have already been killed just since the start of the year. So we've seen a real upsurge in violence by the Israeli army, particularly since this new extreme government came into power at the end of December. So I want you to talk about what that means for Palestinian politics on the ground, for the credibility of the Palestinian leadership, especially given this close security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli army, which was, I guess, temporarily suspended last month after a major incursion that killed something like 10 Palestinians in Jenin. But also security cooperation in general is hugely unpopular among Palestinians. So how does the violence affect this leadership and their credibility going forward, especially in terms of the fact that the leadership's popularity has gone down and the armed elements in the West Bank, their popularity has gone up?
I think the question is very simple, Khaled. Who protects Palestinians? It's really simple as that. I think the fundamental basis of a social contract between the people and their government is that you can at least ensure their safety. And security coordination fundamentally exacerbates the violence against Palestinians by the Israeli military. That's the fundamental equation. You cannot be in favor of something that is, perpetuating your oppression and your killing. And that's what security coordination has done since its inception, since Oslo. And, we've gotten to a place where you have Israeli settler violence that is hitting into another gear. And I think to try to really, forgive the example, but imagine the folks who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. Imagine those folks roaming the hills and towns of your city and streets of your city and going on with full violence and impunity, but aided and abetted by an army and a military. And that's what's happening. And so for the majority of the Palestinians who live in the north, who are surrounded by settlements like Jenin and Nablus and the small villages around those two big cities, they've been experiencing encroaching settlers and settlements and violence from those settlers with the Israeli military, with no one protecting them. And so people take up arms to defend themselves from that violence. And so there's no political equation, there's no human equation, I think, that would accept then your own government facilitating that security situation that fully undermines your life. And that's what these groups of young, mostly men, are doing in their cities, in the refugee camps, are defending themselves and have lost complete faith in the PA, in the security services. A lot of them actually, a lot of these places were Fatih strongholds. A lot of them were men who served in the security forces, come from families that serve in the security forces. Some of them are part of the security forces who are saying no more. And that's a fundamental shift in Palestinian politics and society. And that's going to continue to change. And I think fundamentally, it's a political problem that has a security dimension, and the political problem is what needs to be addressed. And that's why I think the answer is not what the American administration proposed to Abbas about having a Palestinian special force go in and cleaning up. It's about how do you address the fundamental political, social, economic factors that are driving this. And that's where America and Israel are continuously failing. And the Israelis are failing to also handle this in terms of security. So I think this is the fundamental problem. And a part of that political problem is security coordination.
Thanks, Salam. Dana, I want to invite you to add to Salam's response on that, and specifically, what we're seeing now. For a long time, people have speculated about a third intifada. Might this be it with what we're seeing right now? And I also want you to take this time to kind of talk about your research. I know you've written books on Palestinian mobilization and organizing. So what protests and movements have happened in the past, armed or unarmed, and why haven't they been sustained? And what might it take for a more sustainable mobilization of Palestinians on the ground, of course?
Right. So first, I wrote one book. Maybe one day it'll be many more. But just to answer the question regarding the third intifada, I think people say this a lot, and I guess my question would be like, which intifada are you referencing? So like, it's not going to be like the first intifada. We don't have a unified leadership of the uprising. We don't have the kind of civil society and not only the kind of mass involvement of civil society, but also the barriers to coordination across these different Palestinian realities have become much worse since the first intifada. So we don't have the conditions of that kind of mass mobilization that we had in the first intifada. The second intifada was much more armed and much more kind of devolving into armed resistance and fragmented efforts of armed resistance across the Palestinian territories. That I think is more the model that we are turning to at this point. What we're seeing in Nablus, we're seeing in Jenin, and other parts of the West Bank around those areas. Speak to not the first model of intifada, but more the second, where we're going to have localized armed resistance and not so much a coordinated effort necessarily across space, but increased resistance and increased escalations of violence across the territories, for all of the reasons that Salam mentioned. The lack of political pathway forward, the increased repression. I would say even worse than January 6th people. We got a lot of those. Unfortunately, they have taken office, but what's happening honestly in the West Bank in particular is an extremism that we have not seen. So they've outdone themselves. So for that reason, I think that we will see more and more armed resistance, and even though the Israeli forces are very good at repressing, that we still see these kinds of explosions, just because the Israeli intransigence, excuse me, and extremism just keeps ratcheting up. So on that, that question answered. I think you also asked a question regarding like what kind of protest movements have we seen in the past, and so in my book, I talked about how, because of the kind of Oslo framework, as well as particularly post Second Intifada, the kind of international pressure that took place, restructuring the Palestinian Authority and restructuring the security coordination and things like this, it led to certain dynamics of polarization that made the types of mobilization that we saw in the past in Palestinian society kind of less sustainable. So mass movements on the scale of the First Intifada, or even kind of like coordination across political affiliations and across geography was greatly reduced. That being said, there are liminal spaces on the ground where, because of their unique kind of situations vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority, as well as the Israeli occupation, we have seen more creativity and more maybe less sustained but more iterative protests occurring. And I'm particularly referencing East Jerusalem. So in East Jerusalem, we saw successive waves of protest, and each protest movement, like, it hasn't been sustained for years and years, but it builds on the one prior. And what I mean by build on, I mean the organizers are, people who get involved in, say, 2014 or 2017, they sustain relationships, they go on to organize again moving forward, and that's what we saw in the culmination of the Unity Intifada, which was largely emerging out of East Jerusalem and the events that are happening there, where activists and organizers saying we need to capitalize on this opportunity to sustain coordination across the Green Line, across the different Palestinian realities. So in terms of sustainability, like we saw, for example, like everything I'm talking about means that we will continue to see protests, and even if they fizzle out, they build the next steps for the next kind of confrontation, but we might see them more in some places than others. So in the West Bank, we kind of like see an underrepresentation or less involvement in these kinds of movements than we would see in East Jerusalem or in other parts, particularly within the Green Line. In terms of armed resistance, the Lion's Den, for example, in Nablus has sustained like a lot of assassinations and things like that, which is, sorry if I haven't maybe correctly identified them. They're like this militia group that emerged in Nablus. So the Israeli, kind of response has been quite quick and direct. But again, given kind of the realities of the situation, we can expect people to continue to try. And yeah, I don't know if I fully answered the question of like how to sustain mobilization, but
Yeah,
I think people, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you certainly painted a picture of how difficult it is to sustain mobilization given the fragmentation. I would just put in a plug for your book, Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies in Authoritarianism in Palestine, is really, if you're looking for a go-to book on why there hasn't been a Palestinian uprising that can be sustained, that's the book for you. And there's a link in the chat. So Khaled, I want to come back to you and ask you about an issue that's already come up, the so-called Unity Intifada. I should say in May of 2021, we saw in the midst of the Sheikh Jarrah protests in Jerusalem, and then how that spilled over into a war in Gaza. And then we saw a sort of protest spread to the West Bank, but also to Palestinians inside Israel in these so-called mixed cities, in places like Lod and in Akka and other cities where there both Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel live. And this was a kind of new phenomenon. Is this, how significant is this in your view? Does it mean that does it reflect some new trend in the Palestinian national struggle, that it's no longer going to be limited to just the occupied territories? Does it mean that, actually tell us what it means for the future of Palestinian leadership and for the future of the Palestinian national struggle?
Yeah, yes, as has been already alluded to, I think May 2021 was truly remarkable, and for many Palestinians was perhaps the finest moment of unity since maybe the second Intifada in the year 2000. Now, because it told us about the potential, the great potential within the different and fragmented segments of the Palestinian people, be them in the Gaza Strip, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, and inside Israel, and even abroad in the diaspora. We should not kind of forget that is all these protests and demonstrations and support that was universally expressed to Palestine. So there was this kind of movement that was amazing and gave the Palestinians this sense of unity. They saw themselves as one people, steadfasting together on the ground of resistance, regardless of their locations, wherever they are, inside or outside Palestine. So it has reminded them and others even with this oneness of the people, if you like, not only across spaces and locations, but also across generations. Because what we saw in the streets and on social media, this fantastic energy of the young generations. So these are the generations that many Israeli leaders hoped very much that they will forget about Palestine. So now you have various forms of resistance, various forms of creative ways, and various globalized generations of Palestinians everywhere. So that was, I think, the significance of that moment lies there, and in the future potential of it. That is, yes, despite all the fragmentation, we still have the will and the potential to do it. Now, specifically on one of the elements of your question regarding the Palestinians inside Israel. So this kind of spillover effect, I guess, that relates to the Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line. I think this has been, even before this moment, has been proven in the first and the second Intifada, late 1980s, and then the year 2000. So you have dozens, in fact, in the second Intifada, even of people died in support of their brothers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. So you have this kind of effect across borders has always been there. Now, in May 2021, and after the passage of all those many years and the emergence of new generations, we saw that is the same potential, the same energy is still there. So it was kind of very, very telling. Now, on the spillover effect, the question maybe is, what about now and tomorrow? If there was or there would be any third Intifada in whatever form. I think given the current political reality inside Israel and the continuous rise of religious Zionism and all these right-wing fanatical groups who call publicly and advocate for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, either inside Israel or in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, anywhere between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. So these are people who do exist in the government, in the Knesset, officials, and they speak about this publicly. So given this reality and having this in mind, I think the spillover effect, if you like, if we have anything happening in the West Bank at a larger scale, would be felt and will be increased as well in scale and magnitude in the case of any third intifada becomes a reality again in whatever form.
Thank you, Khalid. We have 9 minutes left and one final question for each of you. So I'm so sorry to ask you to make your answers even shorter this time if possible. But Dana, I'm going to come to you for your last question and any last remarks you want to offer. And my question for you is really about the future of the PA. I mean, we've talked at length about the PA's crisis of legitimacy and the growing authoritarianism. We have to add to that their financial crisis that we haven't talked about yet, but are we seeing the collapse of the PA, perhaps the slow motion collapse? And in the event that the PA does collapse, who will fill that vacuum?
Yeah, so I think the last, especially in the aftermath of the second Intifada and the split between Gaza and the West Bank, I think there was some segment of the population that was invested in the PA continuing, and I think that given the current situation and crisis, and the PA's growing illegitimacy has widened, and I think we see that also reflected in polling. So in terms of the PA slow motion collapsing, like, yes, possibly in terms of what it, in comparison to what it was, a couple of years ago, but those institutions don't disappear. Those people who have entrenched interests don't disappear. And especially kind of the security forces, we might see, some members of the security forces defecting or things like that, as we've seen to some degree already, but this is an establishment now. There are particular groups within the security forces that are very committed. Sorry, I'm losing my words. Committed to the PA as a body, not necessarily in terms of its political outlook, but in terms of what it represents for their own kind of personal situations. So we think of like the preventative security forces and things like that. So yeah, on that question, the last thing I might add is, because I know I mentioned it earlier, is and we've kind of this, Dr. Khalid's comments about the Unity Intifada spoke to this as well. But I think that the current Israeli intransigence and the repression and things like that obviously pose great risks to people on the ground. And what we might see if the PA, does slowly lose control is that Palestinians will live in a greater sense of insecurity, and maybe more local forces and local militia groups and things like that will have to fill that kind of vacuum. But given this environment, we see a convergence of Palestinian objectives in a way that we haven't seen. So, like, I think particularly amongst Palestinian youth, like we are now speaking in the same discourse and the same vocabulary about what Israel is, and what, I think a growing understanding of how Palestinians will have autonomy and security in the future. Even if not everybody agrees on how that looks necessarily, one state or what kind of one state or things like this, but at least we are naming the situation in the same way when we weren't before.
Thanks, Dana. Salem, I want to turn to you and kind of keeping with this, the theme of, looking forward. As you know, President Abbas is 87 years old and not in the best of health. So he's not going to be around forever. And yet there's a lot of uncertainty about who or what might come after him, especially as we're not just talking about one succession process, but several for the PLO, for the Palestinian Authority presidency, and even for within Fatah. What do you see happening following Mahmoud Abbas's departure? What sort of power struggle do you see? And if I could ask you to do it in 2 or 3 minutes or less.
You got it, Khalid. Anything for you. I think, look, the current talk around succession is being done in an incredibly undemocratic way. The successors are coming within Fatah. to head the PLO and potentially the PA. And there are those who belong to authoritarian stripe worse than Abu Mazen. I think they would take us to a place very similar to Sisi's Egypt if we're not close to that. The scenario, I can make equally compelling arguments for different scenarios, whether there will be an all-out resistance to whoever they name as the successor. I would say there won't be a public reaction, but a war of attrition against the successor. The internal infighting within Fatah could happen. It can go many different ways. And I think none of those scenarios are scenarios that I want to be in personally. I want a democratic transition of power, and I see elections as the only way that can guarantee us and the people the right to choose who comes next. The PA still holds power. It's illegitimate, it's unrepresentative, but it still holds power. And the wrong person in that driving seat can cause a lot of harm, not just to Palestinians in the West Bank, but to the Palestinian national project. They still have the power of the signature. And I think we do not want to live under an authoritarian regime and a regime that's willing to sell off national rights just to hold a bit of power in the West Bank. So for me, elections are essential. They're one step forward. They don't solve everything. We have a lot of problems to address, but it's about a democratic transition of power that is absolutely necessary at this stage of the national movement. How's that, Khaled?
So good, Salim. Thank you. Khaled, coming to you for the last word, and I want to invite your reflections on the future of the Palestinian national strategy going forward. We've talked about a lot of tactics, elections, armed resistance, popular mobilization. None of them seem to be part of a coherent national strategy. So I guess, how should these elements play together? What should be the strategy going forward? If you could advise Palestinian leadership today, and how do we get there?
Yeah, now to make my answer short, I think the straight answer to this is that an effective Palestinian national program should include all these three strategies that you have mentioned. And in fact, at this very moment, there are several kind of strategic documents floating around within Palestinian fora, produced by intellectuals, thinkers, political activists, that precisely propose a unified strategy using a combination of these three approaches, if you like. And this is something very telling, and I think Dana alluded to this, that is the way maybe there is some sort of convergence in the way that Palestinians are thinking nowadays, from in Palestine, inside Israel, in the diaspora, on the basis of one people, one land, one cause, which is something that we need maybe to keep kind of in mind and observe. This is the straight answer. Maybe there is, for me, over the past few weeks, I think maybe there is another kind of strategy, more urgent strategy. This is a strategy we have been thinking of for many, many years maybe. But there is an immediate urgent strategy that I think is very much kind of needed by the Palestinians, which is, for me, how to face up the policies and the strategies of the current Israeli government, which is specifically the idea of ethnic cleansing, because this is something serious. It is not rhetorical. In the West Bank now and East Jerusalem, we have almost 1 million Israeli settlers, mostly right-wing orientated. Among them, we have between 100,000 and 150,000 ones fully armed, ready to shoot. So can you just imagine the scale and magnitude? You have, let's take, the lesser kind of figure, 100,000 armed settler in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, thinking in line of all these right-wingers in the Knesset, seeing the Arabs and the Palestinians are the immediate enemy, and we just shoot them. And what happened in the village of Huwara near Nablus, when you have 400 armed settlers supported by the army, the Israeli army, doing this kind of maybe rehearsal and burning hundreds of houses and cars and injuring more than 100 Palestinians and killing one. This is something, this is very alarming. It is not kind of a passing event. This could be seen as a rehearsal. Again, just think of a crazy group of, I don't know, these religious guys issuing a declaration on day 0, you have to go out and then start shooting. So we need to protect our people. There is a need, this is the strategy that we need today and tomorrow. How to protect the Palestinians in their villages, especially in Area C, in their cities, in refugee camps here and there.
Yeah, it really seems like this is the missing piece of both the peace process and the Palestinian leadership. There is no entity on the ground whose job it is to protect Palestinians from the soldiers and from the settlers. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it at that. I know we've only just begun to scratch the surface. But on behalf of the Middle East Institute and the Foundation for Middle East Peace, I want to thank our really awesome panelists, Dana, Khaled, and Salim, for a really incisive discussion. And thanks to all of you for joining. And thanks also to my co-host, Kristen. We hope you will join us next week for what will be our last session in this series. Next week's session will be on the role of Congress, help or hindrance, which will feature Josh Rubner from the Institute for Middle East Understanding, Zaha Hassan from the Carnegie Endowment, and Hassan Al-Tayyib from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next week.